Thank you to everyone joining us today from wherever you are. I'm particularly interested in hearing from folks that are not in the UK, just because that's always a pleasure, but it's also a strength behind these conversations that we have about maybe narratives that are international that we don't hear enough from, especially ones that are quite positive or inclusive around different cultures and communities. That's a passion to both my heart and Amanda's. But also because we're also tackling deficit models and disorders. And there are some countries and some models that are much more driven to that than should be. And so that can leave a lot of folks alienated. And so for that reason, I guess I'm really excited to hear from wherever you're from. You're all welcome. And please just tell us. So thank you from Canada, from Dubai. Brilliant. Look, from Kenya and Milton Keynes. Brilliant. So super. And so I'm going to just start off by just saying, me personally, I'm really excited to be here. My name's Atif Choudhury. I am a Bengali man joining you with glasses on, a very peppery grey beard these days, and a very balding head. And I'm sitting talking on what looks like a sofa in my office with a plant and my I don't know what it is really, a shelf behind me. And my pronouns are he and him. And I am really, really excited to kick off this stage 2 of the welcome at the Embracing Intersectionality, Labels and Legacies. I'm now going to gently hand you over to Amanda to describe herself and what really Amanda's about. But before I do that, I just want to say a big welcome to Amanda. I know I have lots of conversations. I have the pleasure of lots of conversation, Amanda. And every time we do have a conversation, I think, crikey, that would be a good podcast. Oh, crikey, we should have filmed that. Oh, crikey, that was amazing. But I'm also in awe because, and I think Amanda doesn't hear this necessarily, but how much generosity Amanda gives me, particularly in my early days, particularly in the early days of confronting what I felt was quite lonely. The intersectionality of people of color, the spaces where socioeconomics and poverty and shame plays a role in how we get ourselves seen, what we risk when we talk about these things, and recognizing people with expertise and knowledge, both in maybe a medical model and a social model, and a passion to go, yeah, these voices matter, and we don't hear about them enough. And I got to sit in the audience and watch Amanda talk, I'd say 15 years ago, and I was so inspired then. But I don't know if I was inspired enough to say, I'm going to go and say hello, and then to come this way and think of Amanda as one of my dear friends, as well as an inspiration to me. It says something about the journey I'm on, but it also says more about the enthusiasm and the generosity of Amanda Kirby. So Amanda, to you, if I...
Oh dear, that's thank you. And that's a really hard to follow. And it's interesting. So I'll let me introduce myself, then I'll cringe as well at the same time, because I find it quite hard to listen to people giving me praise. So I appreciate that. So I'm a white woman I have grey, but I dyed my hair, right? So you can't see it. So it would be lots of peppery bits. I've got big glasses on and a bit of lipstick and a stripy scarf and a blurred background. I'm at home today and my pronouns are she and her. And I identify as, I don't know, an oddball that doesn't really fit in anywhere quite. And works in the crevices of society in all sorts of places and spaces. And I'm delighted to be here. I value the conversations we have and we've had, and all I do is learn from you, and it stretches my brain, which is really important and allows me sometimes to feel uncomfortable or more comfortable, but to challenge the way that we think about the world today and how we live in it and how we try to engage together. So I am so delighted to be here. Please, just don't say nice things anymore, because but I'm really delighted and I value you as a friend. So thank you so much for inviting me here today.
Thank you. Well, that'll probably give you a sense of where we're at in this space as well, and the spaces that we hopefully invite others to be. So much of these conversations is also about power sharing. It's also about recognizing that folks can be this good, not despite these differences that we come with, but because of them and through them. But we don't get there easily unless we're prepared to champion others and feel that, and also to recognize that we're worthy of championing. And that, probably the second part of that, is probably the hardest part, probably the hardest piece of work to do, self-love, So we're going to talk about those things. We're going to talk about some of the challenges that are very real in people's lives. And hopefully we're going to tackle some of the Eurocentrism that's attached to where we use language today and recognize where it's useful. At times it probably is. At times it may not be. I once said, and I'm happy to express it, that I once said that nobody really wants to be reasonably adjusted. They just want to be welcomed. And what does that mean in practice? Are we asking leaders to be psychic? No, I don't think so. I really don't think so. Are we asking? But what we are asking is the idea that we can welcome people and recognize there are inherent barriers that make it harder for some people. That there isn't just a conversation of equality, but it's also deeply a question of equity.
Yeah.
What are the starting points for people's lives? How does that reflect on whether they feel comfortable in a conversation on hidden differences or disability or disablement, and indeed neurodiversity or neurodivergence? All these things deeply matter. And if we continually have a model around labels, then we'll probably be excited about a few people. In fact, we'll probably be excited about a lot of people. But I have a question, which we're going to explore, is how many people do we leave behind? It's why this podcast is called Labels and Legacies. Reasonable adjustments are helpful. But are they only helpful to some people? Are they helpful for everybody? Should everybody share their differences? What happens when they don't? What happens when they won't? What happens when they can't? So these are things that we're going to explore. And I hope all of you get a lot from this. And I hope you share this conversation to folks who wouldn't necessarily yet know where they fit into this conversation. So I'm going to stop there and really, feel excited to have this conversation with Amanda and to ask Amanda some questions as well as we go for it. So I guess my first question is, Amanda, for you, sorry, before I do anything else, I want everyone to realize this, and Amanda's going to do it and I'm going to do it. We're going to move away from HR speak. We're not going to have it's not who we are. It's not the spirit of what we're about. So we are going to talk about reasonable adjustments, but I think we're going to talk the way we see them.
Yeah.
And maybe more. So Amanda, I guess here's my first question is, what is the definition of a reasonable adjustment for you?
Well, I think the first thing is, what's the definition of a reasonable adjustment other people think is a reasonable adjustment? And I think often reasonable and adjustment seem to go together when they don't always go together. So in the UK, and we've got people all around the world, under the Equality Act 2010, that phrase that's used often is reasonable adjustments, which I often find it, I find quite a lot of things amusing, but I often find it funny that we don't detach the two, that it's adjustments, and who's determining they're reasonable. So if you go to the Equality Act and it says that reasonable adjustments are changes that organizations, people who provide services, they must make these changes to prevent your disability, putting you at a disadvantage compared with others who are not disabled. Well, that opens up a whole can of worms already, right? Because, first of all, who's determining you are disabled, and what does that and who is disabling you, right? And it's implying that you need adjusting, which I certainly don't need adjusting, and somebody else is going to determine whether that's reasonable for me. So, I think if we unpack just what are reasonable adjustments, who are they for, right? Who gets them? Who doesn't get them? Because if it says you have to determine and speak out you're disabled, you've got to feel confident and understand that and agree that you are, right, under your own framing, And that's a lot of baggage to carry, or to start with. It also means that you've got agency to be able to vocalize that and confidence in doing so, that if you share that information and you think it's the right thing to do, the other bit is even knowing reasonable adjustments even exist. And for many people, you don't know what you don't know, so you can't even ask for something. So it implies you want to be boxed in a certain sort of way that you feel comfortable with, that you can, and feel confident if you share that information with somebody else, something's going to happen positive, not negative. And those are an awful lot of ifs and buts that are coming in there about what is reasonable, who's disabled, what is an adjustment, and who's deciding what that is. And as soon as we start entering that sort of pathway, it's basically saying, okay, it's hard because I'm a doctor, but I haven't been struck off. I'm still a doctor, but I do feel like it's driving that medical model, which then says you have to know the pathway, be able to access the pathway. That's a big thing. To get a label that says from somebody else who's determined and says, okay, on our ratings you are, or on our ratings you're not. And all of those different aspects create challenges and problems, inequity and exclusion.
Absolutely. And so I guess, it throws the question of what does reasonable mean, given what you said? If I was to think about that, so if we can recognize that self-esteem is a barrier to participation.
Yeah. And shame.
Yeah. So I won't go into it now but folks can look at a blog on our website, which is about why you can't bring your whole self to work. It's under my profile on the website, and why that isn't just a thing that people should just say. I get why they're saying, and it actually comes from a beautiful invitation in a way. But for one person's invitation, for somebody else, it's an imposition.
Absolutely. And it's also implying that you want to bring your whole self. I like to keep some of myself at home, right? And it's not that I'm hiding it. It's because I'm different. We're not one self. We're lots of selves, and we're different selves to different people at different points in time. And sometimes we've learned to put on our work persona, and it's okay to have that, because sometimes we talk about, I have to camouflage, but sometimes we camouflage to cope and survive. And sometimes I think we've got to be really careful about the language we use about adjusting ourselves. So adjusting ourselves might be adjusting ourselves to fit into other people's situations. And we all do that in society to a measure, right? You adjust your conversation, you adjust the tone of your voice, you adjust what you wear because you're going to work rather than wearing your tracky pants at home or whatever it is, So we adjust ourselves. When I stand on a step stool because I can't get to the top shelf in my kitchen, right? Because it's designed for a man of a certain height, certainly not for a woman of my height, I can tell you that. It's too high, all the surfaces. So we adjust our things all the time, but that's by choice in some ways. Now, when people are saying bring your whole self to work, we've then got the challenge, which is how much? And then when we expose all of ourselves, people don't like it, and we can't put ourselves back in the box again, right? So I think those phrases are coming from a welcoming perspective, but I do think they're speak. It's a bit like your whole authentic self. If I knew what my authentic self was, that would help me hugely, right? Do you understand what I mean? So which bits of me are not authentic, or which bit? So I think these phrases are coming from, I think you're right, from a good place. But I think in a neurodivergent community, interpretation of them is a nightmare, right? In reality.
Absolutely. And I suppose it throws up so much. I'm visiting my own experience, I guess, for a moment, if I may as well. And Ellie's put a blog in the blog that I talked about here. So I found I'm actually doing a PhD at the moment, or trying to, and I had to get out my old dyslexia assessment, and actually the first thing I'd forgotten I'd said it, but it said Atif had a normal childhood. Oh. It's written on there.
Really?
It's because that's what I said. That's exactly what I said. And it was, it was 25, I guess. Oh, well, anyway, so it was 20, I can't do the math, but it was about 2 years ago when the assessment was done. So I just said what I felt I needed to say in order to, because my fear was, what if I'm not dyslexic? Then what am I? What if I'm not? And I guess if I was having an assessment today, it would show up ADHD. But so the last thing I want to do is tell them something that would make it even harder. And I suppose it touches on this point that we're talking about shame and the role of that. That, if you have to do more in a workplace, then you're hardwired to share less.
Now, you are. And also, I think at the same time, we hide lots of what we do to compensate. So the leavism, I remember growing up, I think the thing about sort of sharing and disclosing and revealing is that I wouldn't be as honest 40 years ago. I didn't know really at that time either, right? But I couldn't have been as open as I am today, where I am in my career and who I am. But if I look back, I did so much leeching at the edges to compensate for my planning and organizational difficulties. So I work harder, work longer.
Yeah.
I was conscientious, but it really nobody saw it because it was under the table. It was at home. It was a night. It was getting up early in the morning. It was all those things and I think that's the thing of a fear of disclosing the full picture of your compensatory approaches to survival, right? I think frightens people. So they're saying, do this, be open, share. But when you say it, you can look, if I give you, my whole past history of what I was like as a teenager, I was bulimic, I was anxious, I couldn't sleep, I had, real hated exams, was terribly fearful, going into medical school when there's millions of bloody exams, right? All the time. But I couldn't have shared that at that time because people would have looked absolutely horrified and thought of me as incapable. But I had to hide for so long. So it's did I need adjusting? I needed people to understand me, not to me being adjusted, right? I need people to understand and support me. I needed some help with study skills. That would have been great. Nobody taught me how, I had I Post-it notes everywhere and all sorts of things, right? But actually some understanding. I had caring parents that were caring, but I think educationally in the workplace, I think we hide so much because we're fearful of asking for help because it might make us look less competent. And I think that bit, the front we have, which says we're okay, because if we tell people we're not, and I think COVID revealed a bit of that, which we were allowed to peel off some of ourselves in a sense. And we were just saying that sort of, the dogs and cats walking across the, and children coming in. We had a bit of more openness about our lives are messy, Let's be honest about that. I think we've gone back and we're hiding, and I don't think that coming out and is.
But it's a moment of truth, isn't it? I think. I know that we almost feel like that was then and this is now, but I like to think of that experience because, of course, there's giving a moment, at least, to the tragedy of so many lives that were affected and lost. But it was also the first time where the whole world that I can think of, maybe only since World War II, the whole world was connected deeply to one thing. They were affected by this profound thing of survival and fear, but humanity. And I know from talking to CEOs across, the world, actually, in that space, the speed in which we could talk about mental health loss in the workplace, or even for executives and leaders who may have shied away from conversations around imposter dynamics, and obviously the sincerity of anti-racism with post-George Floyd, and where that has gone now, I don't know. And I'm quite
back in our boxes. I think I can see it because somebody said around adjustments, but adjusting the workplace barriers. Kathy's just saying around adjustments in the workplace. I think what's happened is And I've seen it with people going, well, look, we do hybrid working. That means 2 days a week, right? Flex. And we got this sort of, because we don't deal as human beings with messiness.
Yeah.
Well, and that's why we have these hard stops that adjustments mean X. Neurodiversity or neurodivergent traits, whatever framing you want to use, means Y, right? And are you it or not it? Are you in or not in? And then we define it and say, and what that does is exclude swathes of people who can't get into a club that they may not even want to join, but can't get there at all, because cataloging in a dichotomous way is easier than to say, well, if you are, then this is what we do.
Absolutely.
And if you're not, this is, well, too bad, right? And that's what, in terms of reasonable adjustments, is have you got a disability? And this is a measure of whether you do, rather than turning it on its head and saying, if we have open, engaging, inclusive approaches, it is regardless of whether you have a diagnosis, a label, or see yourself as catalogued in this way, we're going to support you as a human being so you can show your best self when in the way that you want to show it. And we're not defining what that self looks like and how it should be, but we're trying to have a universal design approach to, and an equitable approach. And that has to be a better way, because this way ain't working very well.
No. There's so much to that. I hope people really engage on this conversation more with us outside of this, or with each other at least. I get lost in this conversation because I guess, that's why, again, I'm going to thank my team here and the comms team and everybody that's been a guest on this podcast. It's why it's called Labels and Legacies, because labels are liberating for a lot of people. But the legacy of that is what? Is it liberating for everybody? Are we structuring ourselves to only legitimize people's stories or realities or pain through just a diagnosis? Are we just saying they only get to be neurodivergent if they prove it?
Yeah.
And then are they neurotypical until the day they don't? What does it mean? We for DNA, we're very proud of work that we want to grow to do, which is about digital inclusion, and we do it often. But our groups that we worked a lot with are homeless people or service users at Crisis and at Samungos. And they are, of course, interested in talking about ADHD and dyslexia and autism. But I promise you that only those who had gone to prison could provide a magic piece of paper to say what they've got. And that's because things were so low that custodial services and a situation kicked in. Now, do I say to those who don't have that piece of paper, well, you're neurotypical?
No, it's ridiculous. It's so othering anyway, isn't it? Is that you are this or that, right? And like you, I work in the justice setting with homeless organisations and with people at the margin, children excluded, children in care. Because I feel there's the disparity in who gets a diagnosis, who then gets labelled as can get the support and who doesn't, is marked. It really is. This is about inequity in society. It's about different pathways get you in different places. And the longer you go on one pathway, or if you go on multiple, the worst for you is if you're on multiple pathways, right? Because you're less likely to get any support, or you're more likely to be seen as a number of different things which are not positively framed, right? So if you're a multi-system person, which you may, most of the time people don't choose to be a multi-system person. You don't choose to be homeless in that sense, or you don't choose to be excluded from school because somebody's seen you as naughty rather than actually can't sit still and have so excited to give an answer that you just bubble up and you say it and then you get in trouble for doing so, right?
Yeah.
So I think that it angers me that we then have a system which favors certain labels over other labels. So some are much better than others, that those who get them are those who shout loudest or can read or have got the time to be able to go to an appointment. If you have to hold on to your job and you're juggling 3 jobs, going to an appointment where you might lose money and can be a huge gamble, if that's the bit that keeps you in your home with your kids, is a disadvantage. Or you can't read the letter because the reading age is at A level and and English isn't your first language, but that somebody's written this letter which is incomprehensible for most people, that's unfair. We're setting up systems that mean we have decided we want to segregate what we do. We've decided that because that's what we're delivering.
Absolutely. And so I guess it's going to throw the reality of a question, which is, what do we mean by reasonable? You know, what is reasonable? So I'm going to ask you, Amanda, this, but before I do that, I'm going to ask for all folks to think about this as well. Because like I said, I personally find it a little bit demotivating when I hear, with good intentions, people, especially of power, saying we're on a journey. There's nothing more demotivating than people saying we're on a journey, especially when there's an urgency. But at the same time, I want us to be kind to the world we live in, that we're not expecting people to be psychic. So then the question becomes reasonable, as Amanda's really said, is there are so many different starting points here, and there are so many realities. Trauma is a big part of this as well, about how people feel about themselves, to say they matter, that they have rights, but regardless, they deserve it of self-champion. So I'm going to ask Amanda again, in this context, what is the alternative, and is the word reasonable reasonable?
So I think Sammy's just put in, which is, it's not just the employer that has finite resources, the employer too. And the unreasonableness in the context of the workplace, there is a test looking at the size of the organization and what they're capable of. If you're a small organization, you probably couldn't afford to put, a lift in a building that you pay, you're renting, and you would go out of business if you did so. So we have to be reasonable, but it's usually done in the courts of law that we're testing that, which is too late. So we've got to turn it on its head and go. And I think the point about finite resources is important, because how do I manage? And resources and adjustments can be attitude, which doesn't cost money. Mm-hmm. It can be communication, which doesn't cost money, right? They can be being empathic and caring, which takes effort sometimes, but doesn't cost money, right? And I think that if we start from an ethical, but if you start as an employer and go, I want to get the best talent in, right? And I want to attract the best talent that's out there, and you mean it, then you start from a premise which you are going to think about, how do you make your attracting talent as inclusive as possible? Because if that's what you want to do, how are you going to achieve it? Yeah. And by doing that, you start to make your adjustments that are reasonable to get that talent into your organization. Now, you're coming from a different mindset, because you're not retrofitting for Bob, Bill, and Ben, right? You're actually going, if I really truly want to get local talent in, I want to get or national talent in or international talent in from all parts of society, the people who are good and capable and have got the potential, how can I try to do that? And we don't start from a job description which is impenetrable, and we don't start from interviews where it's a whole mystery on what's going to happen and where it's going to happen. And, we start from a premise which was tell everybody everything as much as you can about what's going to happen and describe your business, your organization, and give a welcome, right? You give a welcome. And you say that if you want some support to work with us, and you're not sure what any of this means, just ask us, right? Yeah. So I think that changes whose responsibility it to be reasonable, is that it's worth it. Because it's worth it, because you're going to get good people that wouldn't come through the door otherwise, right? And in society, I always go, somebody was saying in manufacturing, that made the point, which is you wouldn't discard 20% of if you're manufacturing goods, you wouldn't have a process that discarded 20% of all your goods, because that wouldn't be a very good, sort of a model, of working. Well, the same goes if you want to get 100% of the talent or 99% of the talent that's out there, we have to question those things, and we have to keep questioning and gradually adjusting if you can't do it all at once. But I think you can gradually adjust to think of a different. So maybe the adjustments are in our mindsets.
Well, it is, and it does. Thank you. I mean, it is because it's relative. It's moving all the time. You know what was reason. So I guess for viewers watching, and Amanda's right that technically the only thing that can really determine what is a reasonable adjustment is actually fought in a court of law. So a judge will determine that.
Yeah.
There is something about not justice, but access to resources and who has it and who doesn't. That will take a tribunal or something to say this is meaningful. But you can have a waiting list for 18 months or more, etc. And there are various, and there is fatigue and there's lack of resources and the cost of those things. So then one hopes that the reasonable adjustment is really about culture and identity and the culture of the organization that says, well, reasonable adjustment is this and this and this. And it's not a courtroom, it's just what we decide. And to a certain extent, if that culture, and it's a moving place, but if it's positive, it's strong, and it is thinking about universal design, it is welcoming differences, it is hardwired to know that those differences have different equity, then that's a good culture. And there are tools. DNA talks about inclusion passports a lot, and we express those things, that they're about barriers and not labels. They're about barriers that we all may face in different times of our lives, and we shouldn't have to mask them or code that switch or hide them or learn to pretend better. So then the question then becomes is, and I'm going to throw this to Amanda, and I think I'm throwing it to the audience and to myself as well, but throwing it to Amanda as our wonderful guest is then this a conversation for corporates only? Those who are big organizations that have the resources to talk about these things or have the PR budget to make a big fuss about it when they do? How are we going to get there if perhaps corporates only make up maybe, well, no more than really 12% of the UK economy? If we want these conversations to be about everybody's participation, are there examples of good practice that you think have seen in corporates maybe or outside of it? What would you say?
I think there's the good, the bad, the ugly, really. There's thinking you're doing good, but not doing good. There's doing good because you are doing good, and there's not doing good at all, right? And I see probably all three. So, I mean, somebody's put in here in the chat around, are there any statistics on the professions that are chosen by neurodivergent people? The first thing is anybody who's neurodivergent can do anything, right? In any sector of society. Depends what your interest, your motivation and your opportunity is, and I think we shouldn't define people. And somebody said freelance is high. Well, freelance is high because perhaps sitting and fitting into the structures and expectations of others means you don't have a choice. So sometimes the ability to work where, when, how you want to work has become either because you've chosen it because it's the most comfortable place, or you haven't chosen it because people won't make the adjustments to allow you to work in a way that works for you. So I think so what am I seeing? I'm seeing different things going on in different let's think about a large scale organizations to start with, which have got budgets to do stuff, right? So there's some that have jumped in, dived in and went, well, this is the way we do it, and big headlines. And I think I'm not naming any organizations at this point because I don't want a legal case against me. But I think there was a bit of cattle gridding going on. So you have to be it to go into it. And then only if you have it can you go into it, which means we're defining people. We've got certain labels, certain conditions. And I think we've seen that globally, that there's been a high focus on autism and autism hiring particularly. Yeah. And when 60% to 70% of people with autism have dyspraxia and 40 to 50% of ADHD, I question what happens if you, I'm from Wales, what happens if you're AF and AF, what happens if you're not quite autistic enough, you're on the merger of being something else, or you haven't got a label and you can't get it, given that there's long waiting lists for everything. Well, not for everything, for certain things, because there aren't services for some things. So we've got inequity, you've got the wrong label that isn't the one that's in favour. You can't get into the programme, but you can't get in anywhere because you haven't got your ticket, right? So I'm seeing that was done with a good intent, but I think it went back to the days when we were taking adults post-war and put them in factories and with intellectual disability, and then
absolutely.
categorizing. So I think the problem with that is that we don't have the data to understand about what happens next and do people progress. And when you're seen as those people in this program, does that change the perception of your potential? And it's not really truly inclusive. So we've seen that. We've seen awareness raising lots, and I'm part of that, and you're part of that, doing awareness raising sessions. And some of that is a bit of FOMO as well. We better do it because everybody else is doing it, so we better do it. I'm seeing some organizations who've had, and I am working with some amazing organizations now who are having a much more long-term approach to this, which is really welcoming, which is saying we can't do this in 5 minutes, and we need to think about our managers having good communication and empathy and thinking about what they need, and they're being much more reflective. So I'm seeing that even 2 or 3 years on, some organizations are really going, yeah, actually you're right, because not I'm right, but there is a rightness about not rushing and getting it right and developing the conversations that people can have in a safe way. Because, that's the other phrase, psychological safety, that people it's psychologically safe here, and then it's not. You need warning, because it may not be, but somebody's told you, so it has to be. So I'm seeing some large scale global organizations really stepping back. I think they've been slower and more cautious, but I'm actually seeing some really nice, starting to get nice embedded practices with people in the organizations able to voice, being champions in their own organization and be able to, at all levels, to be able to have a voice and be able to participate and share their experiences. And collectively, that feels safer as well than, being a lone voice.
No, I agree with you. I think there are, progress is never linear, really. It's never this straight thing, I think, and nor will lived experience be, because in truth, they're about participation.
Yeah.
And so much of that participation, and so really the theme of today, is about perhaps the few that can share their participation, those who are forced through emotional labor and exhaustion to know nothing else but to do it because there's nowhere else to go. The heart has nowhere else to go. So it is telling the story. And in this sense, for me, I've always said, like, I'm going to stress it again, that we shouldn't expect leadership wherever they are, whoever they are, who may have themselves had to mask and pretend and fit in at different times in the world, to expect them to be psychic. But we can anticipate the welcome that people need by moving the conversation away from who's got what disability diagnosis into what is a disabling situation.
Yes.
And so I've noticed it more recently, this almost sort of reflex to say, I'm neurodivergent, I'm not disabled, as if somehow we're better than people or we're going to throw disabled people under a bus, or that we wouldn't ever be autistic and wheelchair users at the same time. So this doesn't help. And I think it's not an act of solidarity. But I understand deeply why people say it. I just think it doesn't address the conversation or the maturity of it, but more importantly, the humanity of it, to say we're here to address barriers. And we're here to talk about participation. I once said this, and I still feel the same way. And I'm going to bring this to Amanda as well, that as we're coming to the sort of end of some of these things, is that, and it's a shame if we weren't, right? But we're all neurodiverse.
But we are, and we need to say that again and again and again and again.
Absolutely. And I suppose the important thing is, for a lot of people think, well, no, we're not. I said, well, yes, we are. We're all neurodiverse, but we're not all marginalized because of it. And there's the work, and there's the solidarity, and there's the curiosity, and there's the thing of what are we missing when people are not safe to say that or show it.
And I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because when we're talking about I'm neurodivergent, I'm not disabled, there's a sort of hierarchy of terminology which says this label is better than that label. And we've seen it, there's a sort of bleaching of terms and words and language over time. It changes. So, I look back and I think of the Spastic Society, which was for people with cerebral palsy. And then that became a pejorative term to call people spastics, right? And I think this framing of neurodiversity is that we are all neurodiverse. We've all got different brains. We all do things differently. But the social construct of how we engage and if we're allowed to engage, it is hugely variable. Our experiences of that, of life and the world we live in is incredibly different. And I think so I think there is this sort of almost snobism in a sense of saying this label is better than that label.
Right.
But that's the one I'm happy to use. But don't tell me about that one because I don't really want that one. And you see that even with medical terms where ADHD and autism gets services, developmental language disorder and dyspraxia or DCD doesn't get services for adults. Well, what's that about?
Yeah.
Who's that?
And that has deep consequences. The highest. I'm going to say it, and I'm going to gently say it because it is powerful. The highest death count in terms of suicide in this country is one of the highest is black men, autistic black men, undersupported, going through socioeconomic loss and trauma. These things have consequences, and when they're underfunded because of a lottery ideal of what's an acceptable label, what's a politically correct label, what's a socially acceptable narrative for the media, it can cost lives, but it doesn't tell us where the depth of the work is, or that it is intersectional, and there will always be intersectional. I have a question. Sorry, go on.
No, I was just because a label, those labels don't have a meaning about that person.
Yeah,
they never define. None of us are defined by one word or phrase because it doesn't tell us anything about the intersection of our life now or in the past, and the environment we're in. And I think the other bit is just I was thinking about that it doesn't determine what we need. So that doesn't, it doesn't tell you what we need. And I think that's one of the things that we go back to the beginning with the adjustments is in workplaces, often people expect you to tell them what you need.
Yes.
But sometimes we need help and support with what we need because I don't know what's available and I don't know what could help me. And there's a sort of often a disjoint. Well, if you haven't told me, you've hidden it and you need to tell us what you need. And then, and then access to work becomes that's the solution. Here's the package. Go now. We've given it to you. Gone now. Even though life is always changing. It's like we've given it to you today because you've given us this label and that's it. Done.
Yeah. Right. And there lies our challenge, is it? Because we don't always have a culture of informed practice. We're not all safe just because someone says it's a safe place. And we don't always know what's available when culturally we've been so removed from it. And when we have an overarching, and I guess I'm going to, which is a framework, because we are in pain often and we want to have a voice and we want to have self-belief. But the framework is a disorder one. It is a deficit one. I'm not severely Asian or severely brown.
Are you not?
Mildly brown, any more than I'm mildly brown. But apparently I'm severely, dyslexic or severe. So I kind of think there's somewhere along the healing that says, you're not. Absolutely, as Amanda said, you're not. As one of my champions in my life, and having known other champions in my life that said, you're not. You're just somebody wonderful who's here with some wonderful ideas, might need some structure, but crikey, what we're going to do when you get that is going to be awesome. And that's the role of the anticipatory welcome, to look for people and find them and not wait till they prove something or become famous because of it. Because we look for them because they're all around us.
And maybe we're a neurominestrone.
Yeah, so I love that. I love that. So
each one of us is a different ladle, rather than, of things that come out and the different temperatures and different spices are in there and different ways of making it. And we can all create that, and you want to find out what your minestrone mix is, and that's okay.
I'm loving that. I'm already feeling the hunger for that as well. So, Amanda, I'm going to ask you the last question for you, I guess, and it's the one I want leave. In we think about the kickback we've got, man, perhaps there's a conversation for another day more, but we're watching more and more of sort of government statements of anti-wokeness, whatever that even means in terms of anti-something that's just about a conversation. But also we're watching agendas perhaps coming from that are pushing back these conversations and pushing back these, that some of the progresses we're making do need to mature and give birth to something far more beautiful than just label models. And it is universal design. It is cultural competency. It is the excitement of differences and not deficits and the debt we owe to those differences. But my last question to you, in the spirit of that and the challenges and the very real realities of that, if I asked you this, having known you and known how much passion you have for this work and how long you've been doing it. What keeps you hopeful?
You keep me hopeful, Atif, I think, because conversations with people like you and you particularly, often we've had the greatest conversations, and my children and grandchildren that I have hope. I'm hopeful for them that they have. My grandchildren, particularly, they have the opportunity to do and be who they want to be, and I still am angry that people don't have the same. It's not fair, right? And I think that I'm hopeful that even after 40 years of working in this space, I think having a conversation like this wouldn't have happened 10 years ago. And that gives me hope. I think that having conversations and seeing things published, I'm just writing something at the moment, because I see things published in health journals, in educational magazines, we're having some common conversations that we were not having 10 or 15 years ago, 5 years ago. And that makes me hopeful that when you've got medics saying, is this box we put people in the right way to do it, right? And we're going, and in employment, we're going, how do we manage this? We're starting to have some common conversations. And that makes me hopeful that maybe there's a groundswell to say it's time to do something a little different, and we'll try to do that. And Tudor Hart was a GP in the Welsh Valleys in the 1970s, and he talked about the inverse care law. Those who need the most get the least, basically. And I think it's really important that we keep going. If we've got a finite amount of resources in society, how do we make sure that people do get the support they require to be their best self, and not have a society that just determines those who shout get it? And that leaves me hopeful that maybe his thoughts from the 1970s, maybe there's a groundswell, and like that's I remain hopeful, because otherwise it's too depressing not to. I think.
I absolutely love that. And listen, to those who are still here as well, and you haven't left us, I'd put on the chat what keeps you hopeful. I think for each other, if not for me and my sanity and Amanda's just joy, please put that. And we've come to the end of this part of it. Please do engage on the chat, and obviously stay in touch with DNA and Amanda's great work at Do It Profile and all those things. I'm going to hand back to, and I'm going to hand back now to Ellie, but I just want to say thank you and how grateful I am to the energy and the spirit of this conversation. And it's been, it's just a healing conversation with Amanda every time. But that's enough for me. And thank you for listening. Back to Ellie and all of you.
Thank you so much for inviting me as well, Atif.
Yeah, thank you both so much. I can only echo what Atif said there, that this is such a great conversation to get to listen into. I saw someone saying in the chat that this has made them feel hopeful, and I couldn't agree more. And the trigger point for this series was in part that quote that Atif shared in his introduction. No one wants to be reasonably adjusted. They just want to be welcomed. And resources and making that happen are always a challenge for all of us. But as you said, Amanda, caring, listening, communicating inclusively, those things are all free, and more than free, they are often cost negative, because they make workplaces and spaces and cultures better for everyone. And I think that's just a great note to finish on, to think of what you can be doing within your resource capacities and within your power, rather than getting stuck on what isn't within your power. So thank you both again for sharing, to Atif and Amanda, but equally to everyone within the chat who has engaged and asked questions, answered each other as well. I think it's made this podcast feel incredibly alive, and we're all very grateful for that. And remember that this is part of a whole series, and you can listen to the entire of the last series as a podcast now via Spotify. There's a QR code on the screen for that, and I've added that to the chat too. And you can also find out more about the work that we do and how it could help you via that second link in the QR code, both of which I posted in the chat as well. And we'll be returning for our next episode on the 19th of June. And that's going to be focused on the Equality Act process of protected characteristics, and how we can take a more intersectional and meaningful approach to what is legally termed protected characteristics as well. I think about a quarter of the tickets for that have already been snapped up. So make sure that you sign up now so you don't miss out. And I put a link to that in the chat as well. So with that, thank you all so much for your contributions and support, and goodbye.